The observation deck of the Galactic Empire's flagship Dominion hummed with quiet efficiency. Admiral Zektar stood before the massive viewport, his four eyes focused on the blue-green marble that hung in the void ahead. Earth. The third planet of an unremarkable yellow star, inhabited by a species that had barely begun to explore their own solar system. Such a small world, he murmured, his scaled hands clasped behind his back. And yet it continues to defy our expansion. Behind him, Supreme Commander Vorlak reviewed the tactical display. The holographic projection showed Earth's primitive defenses, scattered nuclear weapons, crude spacecraft, and communication networks that operated at the speed of light. Laughably primitive by galactic standards. Admiral, the humans possess no faster-than-light technology, Vorlak reported, his voice carrying the confidence of a warrior who had conquered 17 star systems. Their weapons are chemical-based projectiles and fusion bombs. Our shields can deflect their strongest attacks without strain. Zektar turned, his expression thoughtful. The humans had been contacted 3 cycles ago with a simple message: submit to Imperial rule or face annihilation. Every other species had either surrendered immediately or been crushed within days of first contact. But these humans, they had done something unprecedented. They had said no. Not only had they refused submission, but they had also managed to destroy 2 Imperial scouting vessels using nothing more than modified mining charges and surprising tactical cunning. The losses were insignificant from a military standpoint, but the political implications were staggering. Word was spreading through the outer colonies that a primitive species had drawn Imperial blood. Sir, we have their response to our final ultimatum, Communications Officer Tellish announced from her station. Display it, Zektar commanded. The main screen flickered to life, showing a human male with graying hair and tired eyes. He wore a simple dark suit and stood behind a wooden podium. The image quality was poor, transmitted through primitive electromagnetic signals. To the Galactic Empire, the human began, his voice steady despite the weight of addressing an interstellar civilization. I am President Martinez of the United Earth Defense Coalition. We have received your ultimatum and considered our options carefully. Zektar leaned forward, expecting the traditional surrender speech he had heard from dozens of species leaders. We understand that you possess superior technology and overwhelming numbers. President Martinez continued. We know that by conventional military standards, resistance is futile. However, you have made one critical miscalculation. The president paused, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, but determination. You assume that humanity will fight you the way your previous enemies have fought. You expect orbital battles, fleet engagements, and conventional warfare. But you're not facing a conventional enemy. Earth has never been unified in war, but your threat has accomplished what no conqueror in our history ever could. You've given us a common enemy. Admiral Zektar felt a strange chill run down his spine. There was something in the human's tone that he had never heard before from a species facing Imperial might. We reject your ultimatum, President Martinez declared, not because we believe we can defeat your fleets in space, but because we know something you don't. Humans don't just fight wars, we survive them. We adapt, we endure, and when conventional warfare fails us, we become something else entirely. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the bridge in silence. Typical primitive bravado, Vorlak scoffed after a moment. They'll sing a different tune when our bombardment ships reduce their cities to glass. But Admiral Zektar remained quiet, studying the now dark screen. In his long career, he had heard the defiant words of many species leaders. Most spoke of honor, of fighting to the last breath, of preferring death to slavery. This human had said something different. He had spoken not of fighting, but of becoming. Admiral, shall I order the fleet to bombardment positions? Vorlak asked. No. Zektar turned away from the viewport. Contact the Shadow Guild. A hush fell over the bridge. The Shadow Guild were the Empire's most elite assassins, beings who could infiltrate any world and eliminate any target. They were expensive, but they were precise. Used primarily for eliminating resistance leaders and key figures without the collateral damage of orbital bombardment. Sir, surely conventional invasion would be more economical, Vorlak suggested carefully. This isn't about economy, Commander. It's about sending a message. Zektar walked to his command chair, his mind already formulating the plan. The humans speak of adaptation and survival. Let's see how well they adapt to an enemy they cannot see coming. Within hours, the message was transmitted across subspace to the Shadow Guild's hidden bases. The contract was simple: infiltrate Earth, eliminate the top 100 human leaders, and break their resistance before it could truly begin. The fee was substantial, but the Empire had deep coffers. The response came back within a day. Contract accepted. Expected completion, 7 standard days. Zektar smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. 7 days to decapitate human leadership, followed by a swift conquest of a demoralized population. Clean, efficient. And it would serve as an example to any other species considering resistance. What the Admiral couldn't know was that in a small monastery high in the mountains of Japan, an ancient bell had begun to ring. Its sound carried across valleys and through hidden networks, awakening something that had slept for centuries. The signal was simple, understood by only a select few scattered across the globe. The enemies of humanity were coming in shadows. And shadows, the bell's message proclaimed, would be met by deeper shadows still. In cities around the world, ordinary people began to disappear from their normal lives. A businessman in Tokyo failed to return home from work. A teacher in rural Montana called in sick and was never seen again at school. A street vendor in Mumbai simply vanished from her usual corner, leaving behind only the faint scent of incense. They moved like ghosts through the night, converging on hidden training grounds that officially didn't exist. Ancient techniques thought lost forever were dusted off and combined with modern technology. Old masters who had lived quiet lives as gardeners, chefs, and librarians began to teach skills that had been passed down through bloodlines for over 1,000 years. Humanity was about to show the galaxy that some arts of war were far older than space travel, and infinitely more dangerous than any weapon that could be mounted on a starship. The Empire had sent its assassins. Earth was awakening its ninjas. The transport ship Silent Death dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system, its cloaking field immediately engaging. To human sensors, it was nothing more than empty space. To the 3 Shadow Guild operatives aboard, it was the beginning of their easiest assignment in decades. Kilthera stretched her 6 limbs, each ending in retractable claws that could slice through titanium. Her species, the Veltari, had evolved as apex predators on a world where stealth meant survival. "Primitive world, primitive targets," she hissed, her voice like wind through broken glass. Beside her, Noxran checked his phase shift device, a piece of technology that allowed him to become partially intangible. His people, the Umbrans, existed primarily in shadow dimensions, making them perfect infiltrators. The human security systems are laughably simple. I could phase through their strongest bunkers. The third operative, Zergoth, was massive even by his species standards. The Krillian warrior stood nearly 3 meters tall, his exoskeleton designed for both protection and intimidation. Unlike his companions, he preferred direct confrontation. Why waste time with stealth? I could eliminate their entire leadership in a single night of honest killing. Kilthera's mandibles clicked in amusement. Because, dear Zergoth, the contract specifies that we make their deaths look accidental or natural. Fear spreads faster when people don't know they're being hunted. Their ship's AI chimed softly, approaching Earth's outer detection grid. Shall I deploy counter-surveillance measures? Unnecessary, Noxran replied, his form already beginning to shimmer as he tested his phase abilities. Their technology cannot detect us anyway. The ship glided past Earth's satellite network unnoticed, its advanced systems easily avoiding the primitive radar and optical sensors. Within hours, it had established orbit on the dark side of the moon, completely invisible to human detection. Meanwhile, in a secure bunker beneath the Swiss Alps, President Martinez stood before a gathering unlike any in human history. The room contained 47 people, but to an outside observer it would have appeared to hold only government officials and military commanders. What couldn't be seen were the shadows that seemed to move independently, the slight distortions in the air, and the way certain individuals appeared to be in 2 places at once. "The enemy has arrived," Martinez announced, his voice steady. "Our deep space monitoring stations detected a gravitational anomaly 12 hours ago. Something large entered our system and then disappeared from all sensors." General Harrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, nodded grimly. "All military forces are on high alert, but we're operating under the assumption that conventional defenses will be useless against whatever they're bringing." which is why we're not relying on conventional defenses, said a woman who hadn't been there a moment before. Dr. Sarah Chen materialized from what appeared to be empty air, her movement so fluid it seemed like she had simply stepped out of shadow itself. Officially, she was a linguistics professor at Oxford. Unofficially, she was the 37th Grandmaster of the Iga-ryu school, one of the few remaining practitioners of authentic ninjutsu. The ancient arts were never truly lost, she continued, addressing the room. They simply evolved, adapted to modern times, hidden in plain sight while the world convinced itself that such things were mere legend. A young man near the back of the room spoke up. Tech Sergeant Maria Volkov of the U.S. Space Force looked like she belonged in a computer lab, not a secret meeting of Earth's defenders. Ma'am, with respect, how can ancient martial arts help us against alien technology? Dr. Chen smiled, and for a moment her eyes seemed to reflect light like a cat's. Sergeant, you're thinking like a conventional soldier. The ninja's greatest weapon was never the sword or the shuriken. It was understanding, patience, the ability to become invisible not through technology, but through becoming part of the environment itself. She gestured to the air beside her, and another figure seemed to coalesce from nothing. This was Master Takeshi Yamamoto, who had spent 60 years disguised as a simple groundskeeper at the Tokyo Imperial Palace. Our enemies believe they understand stealth, Master Yamamoto said in accented English. They have machines that bend light, devices that muffle sound, technology that masks heat signatures. But they have never encountered an enemy that can hide in plain sight, that can become one with shadow and stillness, that can strike from directions that do not exist. President Martinez leaned forward. What are you proposing? We let them come, Dr. Chen replied. We let them infiltrate our cities, approach our leaders, prepare their strikes. And while they're hunting us... She paused, and every person in the room felt a chill despite the bunker's warmth. We'll be hunting them. Above them, the Shadow Guild operatives were beginning their descent. Their individual drop pods were marvels of Imperial technology, completely undetectable, designed to survive atmospheric entry while maintaining perfect stealth. Each pod would land in a different region of Earth, allowing the assassins to work independently. Kilthara's pod was the first to break atmosphere, its heat-dampening systems preventing any thermal signature as it streaked through the night sky over Japan. Her target was Prime Minister Hashimoto, currently secured in a bunker beneath Tokyo that the humans considered impenetrable. As her pod touched down in a forest outside the city, Kilthara emerged and immediately activated her natural camouflage abilities. Her chitinous skin shifted color and pattern, making her virtually invisible against any background. She began moving toward Tokyo, confident that she would complete her mission within hours. What she didn't notice was the ancient shrine she had landed beside, or the way the shadows around it seemed to bend and flow despite the absence of any wind. She didn't see the elderly shrine keeper who watched from behind a tree, his eyes bright with understanding. Most importantly, she didn't sense the presence that had been waiting for exactly this moment for over 700 years. Noxran's pod landed in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, targeting the secure facility where the director of the CIA was coordinating global intelligence efforts. His phase-shifting abilities would allow him to walk through any barrier, making the underground complex's defenses meaningless. As he began his approach through the mountain wilderness, Noxran was pleased to note the complete absence of any security measures. These humans truly were primitives, relying on simple distance and natural barriers for protection. He phased partially into shadow dimension to move faster, a technique that would have made him undetectable to any known technology. What he couldn't know was that in a cabin not far from his path, an old Native American man was performing a ritual that had been passed down through his family for generations, a ceremony for speaking with shadow spirits. The man's eyes widened as he felt something alien moving through the spirit realm, something that didn't belong. He reached for a radio with steady hands and spoke a single word in his native tongue, a word that meant Ghostwalker. Across a network of hidden listeners, the message was received and understood. Zergoth's pod landed with slightly less subtlety in the outskirts of London, his target being the Prime Minister and several key military leaders gathered in a supposedly secret location. The Krillian warrior was looking forward to this hunt finally, some action after months of boring stealth assignments. He began moving through the urban landscape, his advanced suit adapting his appearance to match his surroundings. To casual observation, he was just another large person walking through the night, perhaps a shift worker heading home. But London had been watched over by unseen guardians for far longer than most people knew. In the shadows between ancient buildings, things stirred that had protected this city through plague, fire, and war. They recognized the scent of something alien, something predatory, and they began to move with purpose that transcended their human understanding. The hunt was about to begin, but the hunters were about to discover that they had become the hunted. Kilthera moved through Tokyo's streets like liquid shadow, her advanced camouflage making her invisible to human eyes and electronic sensors alike. The city's neon lights and bustling crowds provided perfect cover as she approached the government district. According to her intelligence, Prime Minister Hashimoto was secured in a bunker, 4 levels beneath the Diet building, protected by what humans considered state-of-the-art security. She paused on a rooftop overlooking her target, extending her enhanced senses to map the building's interior. Heat signatures showed guard positions, electromagnetic sensors revealed the location of security devices, and her tactical analysis identified 17 different entry points. Child's play. What she didn't detect was the figure crouched in perfect stillness on the same rooftop, less than 5 meters away. Master Kenji Nakamura had been waiting here for 3 hours, his breathing so controlled that his body temperature matched the ambient air. At 78 years old, he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his entire life perfecting the art of becoming invisible. His training began in childhood under his grandfather, who had learned from masters who claimed their techniques traced back to the legendary Hattori Hanzo himself. Kilthera began her descent down the building's facade, her claws finding purchase in microscopic cracks in the concrete. Her species' natural abilities, enhanced by imperial biotechnology, should have made her completely undetectable to any primitive species. She never saw the shadow that moved alongside her, matching her pace perfectly. Inside the bunker, Prime Minister Hashimoto sat in conference with his security advisors, unaware that he was the center of a deadly game playing out in the darkness above. The room was secured behind blast doors, surrounded by layers of armed guards and electronic surveillance. "Sir, we've lost contact with 3 of our satellite monitoring stations," his defense minister reported. "There's definitely something happening, but we can't identify what." The Prime Minister nodded gravely. "Implement Protocol 7. If these aliens want to play games in the shadows, let's see how they handle our shadows." Above them, Kilthera had reached the building's security system hub. Her portable hacking device interfaced with the primitive electronics, quickly bypassing passwords and encryption that were centuries behind imperial standards. Within minutes, she had complete access to the building's security network. She began systematically disabling sensors as she moved deeper into the building, creating a blind spot that followed her path. The human guards noticed nothing, amiss as their monitoring systems showed normal readings. The alien technology was simply feeding them false data. But as she entered a maintenance corridor, on the second sublevel, something felt wrong. The shadow seemed too deep, too alive. Her enhanced hearing caught something that shouldn't exist, the sound of breathing that perfectly matched her own. Kilthera froze, every predatory instinct screaming danger. She extended her electromagnetic senses to their maximum range, searching for any sign of pursuit or ambush. Nothing, yet the feeling of being watched intensified. In her species' evolution, this sensation had meant only one thing. Another apex predator was nearby. She continued forward. But now every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every corner concealed potential death. Her confidence began to erode as she realized that something was fundamentally wrong with this mission. In Colorado, Noxren was experiencing similar unease. His phase-shifting abilities had allowed him to pass through the mountain facility's outer defenses without triggering a single alarm. The underground complex's corridors stretched before him like a maze, but his enhanced navigation systems had already mapped the optimal route to his target. Director James Crawford of the CIA was conducting a crisis meeting in the facility's most secure conference room, protected by walls of reinforced concrete and layers of electronic countermeasures. To Noxren's dimensional senses, these barriers might as well have been made of paper, but as he phased partially into the shadow dimension to move faster, he encountered something impossible, Someone was already there. In the shadow realm where Noxran's people existed, physical laws worked differently. Matter was fluid, time moved strangely, and navigation required different senses entirely. It was a realm no other known species could access, which made Noxran's people the perfect infiltrators. But floating in the dimensional space ahead of him was a figure that radiated calm awareness. A human figure. The man appeared to be in his 50s, wearing simple outdoor clothing that seemed anachronistic in this realm of shadows and distorted reality. His eyes, however, burned with an inner fire that spoke of knowledge beyond normal human understanding. "You walk in the shadow realm," the figure said, his voice carrying clearly despite the dimension's usual muffling effects. "But you walk clumsily, alien, like a child stumbling through his grandfather's sacred places." Noxran recoiled, his form flickering between dimensions. "Impossible. No other species can access this realm." The human smiled, and around him the shadows began to move with purpose. "We've been walking between worlds longer than your people have existed. The difference is we learned to do it without machines." Before Noxran could react, the shadows wrapped around him like living chains. Not mechanical restraints, but something far more profound, the binding of one who had trespassed in sacred space by those who had earned the right to be there. "My name is Robert Crow. Feather?" the human continued as Noxran struggled against bonds that existed more as concept than physical reality. "My grandfather taught me to walk the spirit paths when I was 7 years old." His grandfather taught him. The knowledge goes back 200 generations. Noxran's training kicked in, and he attempted to phase fully into the material dimension, but the shadow bonds followed him, becoming more solid as they crossed between realms. "You're coming with me," Crowfeather said simply. "There are questions that need answers." In London, Zergoth was discovering that stealth was more complicated than he had anticipated. His species' preferred method of infiltration was to simply overpower any resistance so quickly that alarms couldn't be raised. But this mission required subtlety, and the Krillian warrior was finding human urban environments surprisingly challenging to navigate quietly. His target was in a building that the humans had designated as a temporary command center, coordinating their response to the alien threat. According to Imperial intelligence, it should have been lightly guarded and easily penetrated. Instead, Zergoth found himself moving through streets that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Shadows fell at wrong angles, sounds echoed from directions that didn't match their sources, and everywhere he felt eyes watching from places where no eyes should exist. He had been trained to recognize ambush scenarios, but this was something else entirely. It was as if the city itself had become hostile, actively working against his presence. As he approached the target building through what his scanners indicated was an empty alley, figures began to emerge from alcoves and doorways that his enhanced senses swore had been vacant moments before, men and women of various ages, all moving with the fluid grace that spoke of extensive combat training. "Good evening," said an elderly woman who appeared directly in his path. She stood barely 5 feet tall and appeared to be at least 70 years old, but her stance radiated deadly competence. "I'm afraid you're not invited to this particular party." Behind her, other figures fanned out in a pattern that Zergoth recognized as a classic encirclement maneuver. These weren't random civilians, they moved like soldiers, but soldiers trained in arts that his tactical database couldn't classify. "Stand aside." "Primitive," Zergoth growled, his voice filtered through his suit's intimidation protocols. "You cannot comprehend what you're interfering with." The old woman smiled, and in that expression, he saw something that chilled him to his core. It was the same look his own species reserved for prey that had walked willingly into the hunter's trap. "Oh, we comprehend perfectly," she replied. "You're an assassin from an interstellar empire, sent to kill our leaders and break our resistance. You have technology we can't match, abilities we can't replicate, and training we can't duplicate." She took a step forward, and somehow that single step seemed to multiply the threat she represented. "But you've made one critical error in your calculations," she continued. "You've assumed that advanced technology makes you superior hunters. You've forgotten that the deadliest predators are often the ones that have learned to hunt other predators." Around her, the other figures began to move, their motions creating patterns that seemed to bend light and shadow in impossible ways. Zergoth's threat assessment systems began registering danger levels that should have been impossible for primitive beings to generate. "Welcome to London," the woman said, her voice carrying a warmth that made her words somehow more terrifying. "We've been expecting you." The Shadow Guild's perfect plan was about to encounter something they had never prepared for. Prey that had spent centuries learning how to hunt hunters. Kilthara struck without warning, her razor-sharp claws slicing through the air where she sensed movement. The attack should have been fatal. Her species had perfected the art of killing in single strikes over millions of years of evolution. Instead, her claws met empty air as her target seemed to flow away from the attack like water. Master Nakamura materialized from the shadows behind her, his movements so fluid they seemed to defy physics. In his hand, he held not a high-tech weapon, but a simple tanto blade that had been forged by his ancestors 3 centuries ago. "Your species hunts by ambush," he observed calmly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But ambush requires understanding your prey. You understand our technology, our weapons, our military strategies, but you know nothing of our spirit." Kilthara spun around, her camouflage systems cycling through dozens of configurations as she tried to blend with her environment. Her thermal regulators worked to mask her heat signature while her bioelectric dampeners suppressed her neural activity. But every defensive system she activated seemed useless. The human continued to track her movements with impossible precision, as if he could see through her advanced stealth technology. "Invisibility is not about technology," Master Nakamura continued, moving in a slow circle around his increasingly frustrated opponent. "It is about becoming one with your environment. Breathing with its rhythm, moving with its flow. Your machines make you invisible to sensors, but they cannot make you invisible to the natural world." Kilthara launched another attack, this time using her species' signature killing technique, a multi-limbed assault that struck from 6 different angles simultaneously. It was an attack pattern that had never failed against any opponent. Master Nakamura didn't try to block or counter. Instead, he simply wasn't there when the claws arrived. His body seemed to bend around the attacks like smoke, reforming in a position that should have been impossible to reach in the time available. "You fight like a machine," he said, almost sadly. "Efficient, predictable, programmed. But fighting is not programming. It is art, it is poetry. It is the conversation between 2 spirits seeking to understand which is stronger." For the first time in her career as an assassin, Kilthara felt something she had never experienced before. Genuine fear. Her opponent wasn't just avoiding her attacks. He was demonstrating that everything she understood about combat was fundamentally flawed. In Colorado, Noxrin was discovering that being captured in the shadow dimension presented unique challenges. Robert Crowfeather had somehow bound him using techniques that existed outside his species' understanding of dimensional physics. "How are you doing this?" Noxrin demanded, struggling against bonds that seemed to grow stronger the more he fought them. "The Shadow Realm is dimensional space. Physical laws don't apply here." Crowfeather smiled, his weathered face showing the wisdom of someone who had spent decades walking between worlds. "You're thinking like a scientist trying to understand something that isn't scientific. The spirit world doesn't follow your physical laws because it was never physical to begin with." Around them, the shadow dimension rippled and flowed, responding to Crowfeather's presence in ways that defied everything Noxrin had been taught about dimensional mechanics. "My people have been traveling these paths for thousands of years," Crowfeather explained as he began moving deeper into the Shadow Realm, somehow pulling his captive along without apparent effort. "We don't use machines to access other dimensions. We use understanding, respect, permission from the spirits that live here." "Spirits?" Noxrin scoffed, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Primitive superstition, is it?" Crowfeather gestured to their surroundings where shapes that might have been shadows or might have been living beings moved in patterns that suggested ancient intelligence. "You use technology to force your way into this realm. You tear holes between dimensions like a burglar breaking windows, but you never stop to consider that someone might already live here." As if summoned by his words, the shadows around them began to take more definite form. Noxrin's enhanced senses registered movement that followed no pattern his tactical training could analyze. These weren't random shadows, they were organized, purposeful. And they were definitely watching the intruder who had violated their domain. "The spirits don't like trespassers," Crowfeather said simply, "especially ones who come here to murder their friends on the physical plane." In London, Zergoth was learning that human urban combat tactics had evolved in directions the Imperial Tactical Database had never considered. The figures surrounding him moved like a single organism, each person's actions perfectly coordinated with the others, despite no visible communication between them. "I am a Krillian warrior," he roared, activating his suit's intimidation protocols at maximum power. The sonic burst should have been enough to disorient any primitive nervous system within 50 meters. Instead, the humans seemed to absorb the sound, letting it pass through them without effect. The elderly woman who appeared to be leading them stepped closer, completely unaffected by the psychological warfare techniques that had broken the will of dozens of species. "Yes, dear, we know what you are," she said in a tone that suggested she was addressing a misbehaving child. "Elite shock trooper, trained in 17 different combat disciplines, enhanced with biotechnology that makes you stronger and faster than baseline humanoids." "Very impressive." She paused directly in front of him, close enough that he could have killed her with a casual swipe of his claws. "The question is," she continued, "do you know what we are?" Zergoth's tactical analysis systems were registering readings that made no sense. The humans around him showed no signs of advanced technology, no energy signatures that would indicate weapons or defensive systems. By every measure his training had taught him to rely on, they were completely harmless. But his combat instincts, honed by decades of warfare, were screaming warnings that these beings represented a level of threat he had never encountered before. "We are what happens," the old woman explained, "when a species spends 10,000 years learning how to kill things that are bigger, stronger, and better armed than we are. We are what emerges when necessity forces innovation in directions your empire never considered." She gestured to her companions, who began moving in patterns that seemed random but felt profoundly threatening. "You see, most species develop their combat skills by fighting others of their own kind. Similar size, similar strength, similar limitations. But humans have always shared their world with creatures far more dangerous than themselves. We learned to hunt mammoths with pointed sticks. We brought down saber-toothed cats with nothing but cunning and cooperation. We developed techniques for killing things that should have been impossible to kill." Zergoth activated his weapon systems, extending monomolecular blades from his gauntlets. The weapons could cut through battleship armor, and his targeting systems had locked onto every human in the surrounding area. But as he prepared to strike, something extraordinary happened. The humans didn't scatter or take defensive positions. Instead, they moved closer, their formation tightening around him in a way that somehow made his weapons useless without actually disarming him. "The thing about hunting mammoth," the old woman continued conversationally, "is that you can't meet them strength against strength. You have to be cleverer, more patient. You have to understand that the bigger they are, the more spectacular they fall." Around the globe, similar scenes were playing out as humanity's hidden guardians made contact with their would-be assassins. In Rome, an operative who could phase through solid matter found himself trapped in catacombs that seemed to exist in more dimensions than should have been possible. In Beijing, an assassin with perfect camouflage discovered that ancient masters of Qigong could sense life energy in ways that made optical camouflage irrelevant. Each encounter followed the same pattern: advanced alien technology meeting human techniques so old they had become something beyond mere martial arts. What the Shadow Guild had dismissed as primitive superstition was revealing itself to be something far more dangerous, evolution that had taken a completely different path. On the observation deck of the Dominion, Admiral Zektar watched his tactical displays with growing unease. All 3 assassination teams had gone silent within hours of landing. Their biomonitors showed they were alive, but no tactical data was being transmitted. "Sir," Communications Officer Tellish reported, "we're receiving a transmission from Earth." "Display it." The screen showed President Martinez again, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood figures that seemed to exist more as suggestion than solid form, shapes that the camera couldn't quite capture clearly, silhouettes that moved in ways that suggested vast competence. "Admiral Zektar," the president began, somehow addressing him directly despite the vast distance, "I believe you've sent us some guests. We're taking very good care of them." The image changed, showing the 3 Shadow Guild operatives. They were alive, but clearly captive, bound by methods that the Admiral's technology couldn't identify or analyze. "We thought you should see this," President Martinez continued, "so you understand what you're really dealing with." Your assassins are the best in the woo. Admiral Zektar stared at the transmission in disbelief. 3 of the galaxy's most elite assassins, operatives who had never failed a mission, captured by what his intelligence reports insisted were primitive beings with no advanced technology. Impossible, Supreme Commander Vorlak breathed beside him. The Shadow Guild are legends. They've eliminated targets on worlds with technology centuries ahead of these humans. But the evidence was undeniable. On the screen, Kilthera hung suspended in what appeared to be ordinary rope. Yet every time she struggled, the bonds seemed to anticipate her movements and tighten accordingly. Noxran sat motionless in what looked like a simple wooden chair, but his phase-shifting abilities had clearly been neutralized by means the Admiral couldn't fathom. Zergoth, the unstoppable Krillian warrior, was bound by what appeared to be silk threads that somehow held his massive frame immobile. "We want to make you an offer," President Martinez continued from the screen. "A trade, if you will. Your assassins for a conversation." Admiral Zektar found his voice. "You dare negotiate with the Galactic Empire? You hold 3 prisoners and think this gives you leverage?" The president's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the shadows behind him. For just a moment, the Admiral caught glimpses of figures that made his predatory instincts scream warnings. "Admiral, with respect, I think you misunderstand the situation," Martinez replied calmly. "We're not holding prisoners. We're offering hospitality to unexpected guests while we discuss the future relationship between Earth and your empire." Behind the president, one of the shadow figures stepped forward just enough to become visible. It was Dr. Sarah Chen, though she seemed somehow different from the academic records and imperial databases. There was a presence about her that reminded Zektar uncomfortably of the apex predators from his homeworld. "Your operatives are being treated well," she said, her voice carrying clearly across space. "They're learning about human culture, human philosophy, and human approaches to conflict resolution. It's quite educational for all involved." The transmission shifted to show Kilthera again, but now the Admiral could see her surroundings more clearly. She was in what appeared to be a traditional Japanese garden, surrounded by humans who were demonstrating various techniques that seemed to violate the laws of physics. An elderly man was showing how to become completely invisible while standing in full sunlight. A young woman was demonstrating how to walk across water without disturbing its surface. "Your operative is quite skilled," Master Nakamura's voice came from off-screen. "But she's learning that skill without understanding is merely complicated brutality. We're teaching her the difference between technique and art." The view changed to Noxran, who was sitting in what looked like a Native American sweat lodge. Around him, figures moved between dimensions with ease that made his technological phase-shifting look crude by comparison. "The spirit paths are not highways for invaders," Robert Crowfeather explained to his captive audience. "They are sacred spaces that must be walked with respect and understanding. Your people have the technology to force entry, but you lack the wisdom to belong there." Finally, the transmission showed Zergoth in what appeared to be a London tea shop, surrounded by elderly humans who were casually demonstrating combat techniques that his tactical databases insisted were impossible. "The lovely thing about human martial arts," the elderly woman from the alley was explaining while pouring tea, "is that they were developed by people who had to fight things much larger and stronger than themselves. Dragons, if you believe the legends, but certainly bears, tigers, and warriors in full armor." She offered Zergoth a cup of tea with perfect politeness. "We learned that brute force is rarely the answer. Intelligence, patience, and understanding your opponent's weaknesses, these are the tools that let the small defeat the large." Admiral Zektar felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of conquest: uncertainty. Every tactical protocol in his experience suggested that overwhelming force should have resolved this situation within hours. Instead, his forces were being lectured like students. "What do you want?" he asked finally. President Martinez reappeared on screen. "A conversation. Face to face. You, me, and a small delegation from each side. No weapons, no technology beyond what's needed for basic life support. Just talking. And if I refuse?" The president's smile was patient, almost grandfatherly. "Then your operatives will continue their education indefinitely." "They're not prisoners, Admiral. They're students. And we have a very comprehensive curriculum." Behind him, the shadows seemed to deepen, and for a moment Admiral Zektar glimpsed something that made his blood run cold. In those shadows moved figures that weren't quite human anymore. beings who had spent so long perfecting the arts of stealth and combat that they had transcended normal limitations. Besides, President Martinez continued, I think you're curious. 3 of your best operatives neutralized without a single shot fired, without any advanced technology, by people your databases classify as primitives. Aren't you wondering how we did it? Admiral Zektar was indeed wondering, more than wondering. He was professionally fascinated by a tactical puzzle that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. One meeting, he said finally. Neutral ground. A single shuttle for each side. Excellent. There's a location we'd like to suggest. The transmission showed coordinates for a point in space equidistant between Earth and the Imperial fleet. Completely empty space. No possible advantages for either side. We'll construct a simple meeting facility, President Martinez explained. Basic life support, artificial gravity, nothing more sophisticated than necessary for survival. Will 12 hours be sufficient for you to prepare? Zektar nodded slowly. Agreed. But Admiral Martinez, if this is some kind of trap... President Martinez, the human corrected gently. And Admiral, if we wanted to set a trap, would we have announced it in advance? Would we have shown you our capabilities so openly? The logic was sound, but something about the human's confidence was deeply unsettling. No species in the galaxy's history had ever been this calm when facing Imperial might. 12 hours, Zektar confirmed. The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in silence. Finally, Vorlak spoke. Sir, this could be an opportunity. If we can get close enough to analyze their techniques, understand how they neutralized our operatives. I'm aware of the intelligence value, Zektar cut him off. But I'm also aware that we're dealing with something completely outside our experience. He turned to face his bridge crew, noting the uncertainty in their expressions. These were veterans of dozens of campaigns, soldiers who had never encountered an enemy they couldn't understand and defeat. Prepare my shuttle, he ordered, and have the science division prepare every passive sensor they can fit aboard. If these humans want to teach us something, we're going to learn everything we can. What Admiral Zektar couldn't know was that 12 light-years away, in a monitoring station hidden in the asteroid belt, other beings were watching with intense interest. The hegemony had been observing both the Empire and this strange human species for months, waiting to see which would prove the stronger. The hegemony's calculations had suggested that the Empire would crush human resistance within days, paving the way for their own expansion into this sector. But these developments were unexpected. Perhaps it was time to reconsider their assessment of this species that called itself human. On Earth, in hidden facilities around the globe, masters of ancient arts were preparing for a different kind of demonstration. The meeting with Admiral Zektar would be more than a negotiation. It would be an education in possibilities the galaxy had never imagined. The Empire had sent its best killers. Earth was about to show them what true mastery looked like. The meeting station materialized in the void exactly where promised. A simple cylindrical structure that looked more like a space-age conference room than any military installation. Admiral Zektar's shuttle approached cautiously, his sensors confirming that the station contained nothing more dangerous than basic life support and gravity generators. No weapon signatures, no shield generators, no hidden compartments, his pilot reported. It's exactly what they said it would be. Zektar studied the readings with professional paranoia. In his experience, when something seemed too straightforward, it usually was. But his sensors detected nothing beyond the promised basic facilities. Sir, the human shuttle is approaching from the opposite vector, his communications officer announced. On the view screen, Zektar watched a craft that was almost insultingly primitive by Imperial standards. It moved with chemical thrusters, had no visible energy shielding, and appeared to be constructed primarily of metal alloys that the Empire had abandoned centuries ago. Yet something about the way it moved troubled him. Despite its primitive technology, the human craft approached with a precision that spoke of exceptional piloting skill. It aligned with the docking port so smoothly that it seemed almost choreographed. Both shuttles are docked, his pilot confirmed. Station is pressurized and ready for occupancy. Zektar straightened his dress uniform and checked his recording devices one final time. Whatever happened in this meeting, Imperial Command would want a complete record. The airlock cycled with a soft hiss, and Zektar stepped into the meeting station's central chamber. It was spartanly furnished, a simple table, chairs designed to accommodate various anatomical configurations, and lighting that somehow managed to be both functional and oddly peaceful. President Martinez was already seated, along with two companions. Dr. Sarah Chen sat to his right, looking like nothing more threatening than an academic. To his left sat a man who appeared to be in his 60s, wearing simple clothing that suggested he might be a farmer or craftsman. What made Admiral Zektar pause wasn't their appearance. It was their complete absence of fear. Every other species leader he had encountered in similar circumstances had shown signs of stress, intimidation, or at least heightened alertness. These humans seemed as relaxed as if they were attending a social gathering. Admiral, President Martinez rose and extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting. Thank you for coming. I'm sure this is irregular by your standards. Zektar clasped the offered hand, noting the calluses that spoke of manual labor despite the human's political position. President Martinez, I confess this entire situation has been educational. Please sit. I'd like you to meet my colleagues. Dr. Chen you've seen on our transmissions. And this is Master Liu Wei, who represents certain specialized interests in our resistance. Master Liu inclined his head politely. He appeared completely unremarkable except for his eyes, which held a depth that reminded Zektar uncomfortably of very deep water. Now then, President Martinez said once they were all seated, I imagine you have questions. Several thousand, Zektar admitted. But let's start with the obvious one. How did you neutralize 3 Shadow Guild operatives without any detectable technology? Dr. Chen smiled. Admiral, you're approaching this from the wrong direction. You're asking how we defeated superior technology, but that's not what happened. She gestured to the air beside her, and Admiral Zektar's enhanced vision caught something impossible, a figure that seemed to exist in the space between visible and invisible, present yet somehow not entirely there. What you call superior technology, the semi-visible figure spoke with Master Nakamura's voice, though the man himself was supposedly still on Earth, is based on understanding the laws of physics and using them to your advantage. But what happens when you encounter beings who have learned to work with laws you didn't know existed? Zektar's instruments registered the presence of Master Nakamura, but according to his sensors, the man was simultaneously in this room and still on Earth. The readings made no scientific sense. Quantum entanglement, Master Liu said simply, noting the Admiral's confusion. Your science understands the principle, but hasn't learned to apply it to consciousness. We discovered long ago that with sufficient training, awareness can exist in multiple locations simultaneously. That's impossible, Zektar stated flatly. Consciousness requires a physical brain, neural pathways, biochemical processes. Does it? President Martinez asked. Or is that simply the limit of your current understanding? Around the table, the air began to shimmer slightly. Admiral Zektar's enhanced senses detected movement, but his instruments couldn't locate the source. Gradually, other figures began to materialize. Master Yamamoto from Tokyo, Robert Crowfeather from Colorado, the elderly woman from London whose name he still didn't know. This is how we knew you were coming, Dr. Chen explained, as the impossible gathering took shape. Our watchers exist in multiple states of reality simultaneously. When your ships entered this system, we felt the disturbance in dimensions you don't even know exist. Admiral Zektar was a veteran of interstellar warfare, trained to adapt to any tactical situation. But this was beyond tactics. It was a fundamental challenge to his understanding of reality itself. You're saying that human consciousness can, transcend physical limitations? Not all humans, Master Liu replied. Only those who have spent decades learning to still the mind, to observe without judging, to exist without needing to control. What you call supernatural abilities, we call natural talents that most people never develop. But even if this is true, Zektar said, struggling to maintain his analytical perspective, consciousness without technology has limits. You can't project force, can't affect physical objects, can't... His words were cut off as his chair suddenly rotated 90 degrees, though no one had touched it. His recording devices shut off simultaneously, though they showed no sign of electromagnetic interference. The lights dimmed and brightened in a pattern that matched his heartbeat. Admiral, President Martinez said gently, you're still thinking in terms of limitations. What if consciousness isn't limited by physical laws? but is instead the force that creates those laws in the first place. Master Lu stood and walked to the center of the room. As he moved, the artificial gravity seemed to bend around him, allowing him to step onto the wall and then the ceiling, as if changing his personal orientation to the universe. "Your empire conquers through superior force," he said, speaking from a position that should have been impossible. "You build bigger weapons, faster ships, stronger shields, but force is just one expression of will, and will is just one expression of consciousness." He gestured, and the station's bulkheads became transparent, showing the vast emptiness of space around them. "What if we told you that this entire meeting station exists because we're willing it to exist? That the only reason you're breathing right now is because we've decided that you should breathe?" Admiral Zektar's threat assessment systems were screaming warnings, but about what? He couldn't determine. Every instinct told him he was in mortal danger, yet his sensors detected no weapons, no energy buildups, no hostile actions of any kind. "This is what your assassins encountered," Dr. Chen continued. "Not superior technology, but beings who had learned to exist outside the normal constraints of physical reality. Kilthera's camouflage couldn't hide her from someone who perceives life energy directly. Noxran's phase shifting was crude compared to consciousness that naturally exists in multiple dimensions. Zaragoth's strength meant nothing against opponents who could alter the fundamental forces acting on his body. "What do you want?" Admiral Zektar asked, his voice hoarse with a fear he was only beginning to understand. "The same thing we've always wanted," President Martinez replied. "To be left alone, to develop in our own way, at our own pace. Your empire can continue its expansion in other directions. There are millions of worlds in the galaxy that would benefit from imperial civilization, but Earth is not one of them. Earth is different." Master Liu had returned to normal orientation and resumed his seat. "We've chosen a path that leads in directions your civilization hasn't explored. We're not better or worse than you, Admiral. We're simply incompatible." President Martinez leaned forward. "But we're not unreasonable. We're willing to coexist peacefully, trade information, share discoveries that might benefit both our peoples. The galaxy is vast enough for multiple approaches to existence." Admiral Zektar sat in silence for long moments, processing implications that challenged everything he thought he knew about the universe. Finally, he spoke. "And if the Empire refuses? If my superiors decide that humanity represents a threat that must be eliminated?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, though the environmental controls showed no change. "Then," President Martinez said softly, "you would discover that defensive capabilities developed over millennia of learning to survive impossible odds can become quite aggressive when properly motivated." Around the table, the assembled masters exchanged glances that spoke of capabilities Admiral Zektar was only beginning to suspect. "But we hope it won't come to that," Dr. Chen added. "Violence is inefficient." Admiral Zektar returned to the Dominion in thoughtful silence, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. The meeting had lasted only 2 hours, but in that time, every assumption he held about the nature of reality had been challenged and found wanting. "Sir," Supreme Commander Vorlak approached as the Admiral stepped off his shuttle. "How did the negotiations proceed?" Zektar paused before answering, studying his second-in-command's expectant expression. How could he explain that the humans had demonstrated abilities that transcended known physics? That consciousness itself might be far more powerful than the Empire had ever imagined? "Prepare a full tactical analysis for transmission to command," he said finally, "and schedule a conference with all senior officers. We need to discuss our strategic options." "Sir, with respect, what strategic options?" "We have overwhelming firepower. If diplomacy has failed, surely we proceed with conquest as planned." Admiral Zektar looked at his subordinate for a long moment. Vorlak was a capable officer, a veteran of 17 successful campaigns. But like most Imperial military personnel, his thinking was limited to conventional paradigms of force and technology. "Commander, tell me what you know about the Shadow Guild." "Elite assassins, sir. The finest infiltrators in the galaxy. Undetected mission success rate of 100% over 3 centuries of operations. And they're currently prisoners of a species that shouldn't have been able to detect them, let alone capture them." Vorlak's confidence faltered slightly. "Yes, sir. The tactical implications are unclear." "The tactical implications," Zektar said quietly, "are that we may be facing something completely outside our understanding of warfare." In the hours that followed, reports began filtering in from across the galaxy, That added to Admiral Zektar's growing unease. Imperial intelligence had been monitoring Earth's communication networks, expecting to detect panic and military preparations as news of the alien threat spread. Instead, they found something else entirely. Around Earth, hidden facilities were activating that had never appeared on any surveillance scan. Ancient monasteries were revealing technology that predated known civilization. Dojos and training centers that had appeared to be simple martial arts. Schools were showing energy signatures that Imperial science couldn't classify. "Sir," the intelligence officer reported during the senior staff meeting, "we're detecting organized movement of personnel to strategic locations worldwide, but we can't track the individuals involved. They simply disappear from our sensors between one observation and the next." "Teleportation?" suggested the science officer. "No, sir. Teleportation would leave quantum signatures, energy residue, gravitational disturbances. These individuals are simply ceasing to exist in one location and appearing in another with no detectable method of transit." Admiral Zektar studied the global map displayed on the main screen. Red dots marked locations where human activity had been detected, but the pattern made no strategic sense according to conventional military doctrine. "They're not preparing for an invasion," he realized aloud. "They're preparing for something else entirely." "Sir?" Before he could explain, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The communications officer looked up from her station with an expression of confusion and growing concern. "Admiral, we're receiving transmissions from Imperial Command, but they're not coming through subspace." "Explain." "The signals are arriving instantaneously, sir. No transmission delay, no quantum fluctuation markers. It's as if the messages are originating from inside our own communication systems." Admiral Zektar felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental controls. "Display the message." High Admiral Kethmore appeared on the main screen, his scaled features showing the controlled aggression that had made him legend throughout the Empire. Behind him, the command center of the Imperial dreadnought Eternal Conquest gleamed with the efficiency of absolute military power. "Admiral Zektar," Kethmore's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We've received your preliminary reports about the human situation. Your assessment that these primitives pose a significant threat is difficult to accept." Zektar straightened in his command chair. "Sir, I strongly recommend that we reconsider our approach to this species. Their capabilities extend far beyond anything in our current tactical databases. So I've been told, which is why I'm personally assuming command of this operation." High Admiral Kethmore's expression hardened. "The Eternal Conquest will arrive in your system within 12 hours along with Battlefleet 7. If these humans possess abilities unknown to Imperial science, then we'll study them. After we've conquered their world, sir." "I believe that would be a serious tactical error, Admiral Zektar." The High Admiral's voice carried a warning that every experienced officer knew to heed. "You will maintain current position and await our arrival. Any attempt to negotiate further with the humans is forbidden." "Is that understood?" "Understood, sir." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in tense silence. Admiral Zektar stared at the now dark screen, calculating probabilities and outcomes with growing dread. "Sir," his communications officer spoke hesitantly. "There's another message coming in. This one is from Earth. Display it." President Martinez appeared on screen, but something was different about his appearance. He seemed more solid somehow, more present, as if the transmission was carrying more than just light and sound. "Admiral Zektar, we're aware that your high command has decided to escalate the situation. We're sorry to hear that." Behind the president, shadows moved with purpose, and Admiral Zektar caught glimpses of figures preparing for something that looked nothing like conventional military deployment. "We had hoped," President Martinez continued, "that wisdom would prevail, that your empire would recognize the mutual benefits of coexistence rather than forcing a conflict neither of us truly wants." The president paused, and in that silence, Admiral Zektar heard something that made his scales crawl. The sound of breathing that was perfectly synchronized with his own heartbeat. "But if Battlefleet 7 insists on coming here," President Martinez said, his voice carrying a sadness that somehow made it more terrifying, "then we'll be ready for them." The transmission shifted to show views of Earth from space. But these weren't images captured by Imperial surveillance. These were perspectives from points in space where no human technology should have been able to exist, unless consciousness itself could serve as an observation platform. Admiral, your empire conquers through superior firepower. You destroy orbital defenses, eliminate planetary shields, and break the will to resist through overwhelming force. It's an effective strategy against civilizations that fight the way you fight. The view changed again, showing Battlefleet 7's massive dreadnoughts moving through hyperspace toward Earth. But superimposed, over the image were other shapes, shadows that moved between and around. The Imperial ships like schools of fish swimming through a reef. But we've never fought the way others fight, President Martinez concluded. We've always had to be more creative. Admiral Zektar was about to respond when every system on his ship simultaneously displayed the same message. With respect, Admiral, you might want to consider whether your loyalty is to the Empire's expansion or to the lives of the beings serving under your command, because in approximately 11 hours and 47 minutes, they're going to be facing something that no amount of armor or shielding can protect them from. The message vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the normal operational displays. How did they access our systems? Orlak demanded, his voice tight with stress. Admiral Zektar didn't answer immediately. He was remembering something Master Liu had said during their meeting, that consciousness might be the force that creates physical laws rather than being bound by them. If that were true, then conventional concepts of security, defense, and warfare might be completely irrelevant when facing an enemy that could manipulate reality at a fundamental level. Communications, he ordered finally. Send a priority message to High Admiral Kethmore. Full encryption, maximum priority. Yes, sir. Message content. Admiral Zektar took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say might end his career, or save countless lives. Message begins. High Admiral, respectfully request immediate reconsideration of assault on Earth. Intelligence indicates human capabilities extend beyond conventional parameters. Recommend diplomatic solution before irreversible escalation occurs. Admiral Zektar commanding. Sir, Vorlak said quietly, if you're wrong about this, if I'm wrong, Commander, I'll face court-martial and disgrace. But if I'm right, and we proceed with this attack, Admiral Zektar looked out at the blue-green world hanging in the void ahead of them. Then we may be about to discover that there are some victories that cost far more than defeat. In the depths of space, Battlefleet 7 continued its inexorable approach toward Earth, its commanders confident in the superiority of Imperial technology and tactics. But in the shadows between stars, other movements were beginning, movements that followed no laws the Empire understood. Guided by consciousness that recognized no limitations the galaxy had ever imagined,